By now, you've learned about the early successes of President Nixon's administration, especially in the area of foreign policy. But by the end of the 60s, we began to see some economic problems arising in part because of the large federal government spending on Vietnam and the welfare programs under the Great Society. Just like the Great Depression and the New Deal, this relied on deficit spending. So what happened? We had inflation, which put more money into the economy, which devalues the dollar, and then things cost more. And things cost more, but people aren't earning more, and it stagnates. This is called stagflation. Make sure you take a look at the quick video clip that I've posted on Classroom. But the bigger problem, and I remember this vividly in the 70s, was the oil crisis. We were very dependent on Middle Eastern and African oil, and there was a group known as OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Yemen, etc. And they raised their prices for political reasons. Israel and its Arab nations were continually at war, and they put an embargo on oil shipments because we were an ally of Israel. So what happens? They retaliate by increasing prices by 70% and then another 130%. I remember this vividly. I can remember my parents saying that we were to walk and ride our bikes as much as possible because the price of gasoline was so high and the price of home heating oil was so high that we had to wear sweaters at all times. And my father was crazy and would keep the temperature down about 58 degrees. But so if you're paying that much for gasoline, you're going to have less money available for other things as those prices are increasing. The economy continued to slow. The manufacturing boom that we had seen after World War II slowed down, and countries, especially Japan, was growing and sending its exports. If you remember, we fully funded Japan's defenses, which is why they were able to develop their electronics and cars. The picture shows some early Datsuns. Datsuns were the forerunners of Nissans, and I had my first Nissan in 1984, brand new, cost me $3,500. It was red, it had a stick shift and no air conditioning and an AM radio. But as a result of all these Japanese imports, factories started closing and rising unemployment, especially in places like the Midwest and Detroit, where they dependent on making American cars. So as a result, in the late 60s and early 70s, and really through the entire 70s, there was a recession and people were spending less because they had less to spend. So the economy was struggling, and Nixon raised taxes hoping that Americans would reduce spending, which could lower prices. He also hoped that if the Fed raised the interest rates, it would help with consumers' spending. In his last attempt to stop inflation, he put a 90-day hold on wages and prices and tried to regulate future increases. So the government got very, very involved in trying to regulate the economy. But as you can see from the chart, it didn't work, and prices began to rise throughout the early 70s. So we know, after doing your Watergate WebQuest, that Nixon resigned in August of 74, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, took office. He was the only man in the history of the United States to not be elected as president or vice president when he got to that job. Inflation was still very high, and unemployment was almost 9%. Today, with the current pandemic, it's around 14%, but the Trump administration is hopeful that that will go down very soon. So Ford and his administration came up with this really simple quote or acronym, WIN, which meant whip inflation now. And if you look at the pictures, they were very similar to like World War II propaganda. They encouraged Americans to cut down on oil. This was hands-off, though, and had very little effect on the economy. People were encouraged to carpool and walk and things like that. But overall, it didn't help, and Americans were really struggling with the cost of items. So Ford very smartly continued to employ Kissinger as his Secretary of State, who had worked with both Nixon and Johnson. And he signed the Helsinki Accords with world leaders, which finally, since 1945, recognized the USSR's borders with Eastern Europe. So this was a beginning of a little bit of thawing, at least in that way. The Soviets promised to protect human rights In particular, Jewish Soviets were not allowed to practice or allowed to leave the country. The Soviets said they would do this, and then they didn't. So détente was really not successful under Ford's administration. 1976 marked the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the United States. I don't know why I have that line through President Carter's face, but today you might be familiar with him from all his ads for Habitat for Humanity, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize. But in 1976, he was the Democratic candidate for the president, ran against Ford, and Americans voted for him in large part because he was an outsider. He was a governor, he was a peanut farmer, he was a born-again Christian, and he projected a strong moral image, and people wanted to get rid of Nixon and all the Watergate issues. The election results were very close. As a Democrat, people feared that Carter would raise taxes and was too liberal. So one of the first things he had to do was take on the oil issue, but he had little success. He tried tax cuts, he adjusted government spending, he believed that we were over-reliant on foreign oil. And I can remember him making a commercial where he pushed for people to use less oil, and he wore a cardigan sweater as an example of, do like I do and conserve energy. He created the Department of Energy and promoted alternative sources like coal and solar. Coal, not so much today. Many environmentalists don't believe in it, although the president is promoting its use. And wind power was not yet a thing. Business leaders asked Carter to deregulate the oil industry, and in this way they thought they could sell more oil. But again, it wasn't too successful. A lot of political instability in the Middle East, and Carter gave an unpopular speech that became known as the Crisis of Confidence. Please make sure you listen to that 5-minute clip that was very unpopular because some people thought that Carter was implying that the American people themselves were responsible for this economic crisis. So look at Carter's poll ratings. By 1978, spring of 78, he was way, way below 40%. Although he was seen as honest, he didn't work well with Congress, and he had no ties to Washington and really didn't know how things worked in Washington. And Congress blocked all his energy legislation, and many people turned against him. He had no clear-cut agenda, no plan, and people were getting desperate to fix the economy. Foreign policy, not too successful. Again, seen as very moral, seen as a civil rights activist. He showed a real commitment to human rights. He even chose the first African-American ambassador, Andrew Young, there on the left, to be the ambassador to the UN. And he did give the Panama Control back to Panama. If you remember, we had built it and kept it for 60 years, and this was kind of an easy fix because we no longer needed it. But the big problem came with the Soviet Union. In December of 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan, and Carter told them to get out. They refused, and as a result, we boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. 4 years later, the Soviet Union retaliated by boycotting the Summer Games in Los Angeles. He did find some success, and at Camp David in Maryland, he helped broker Israel and Egypt to meet and sign a peace accord known as the Camp David Accords. Very controversial among many Arab nations because they didn't want to see any leniency towards Israel, but it was the first step in achieving some peace in the Middle East, which had been the center of hostilities, as we know, since the end of World War II. But the real crisis came at the end of the 70s, about 3/4 of the way through his term. The man on the right was the Shah of Iran, who was an inherited position, and he was in power for a long time. He had westernized Iran, and he antagonized many of the traditionalists who wanted a Sharia theocracy. And their leader was the Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the Islamic Revolution. So we had been a supporter of the Shah, and a large reason for that was because we got oil from them, and it helped us kind of keep the Soviet Union in control. But as we said, he began to lose popularity, and in January of '79, he was thrown off the throne and ran to the United States. And the first theocracy was established in the Middle East. Here's the picture you can see of the revolution that shook up the world. There's the Islamic leaders purging their society of anything Western, and once again, women were forced to dress traditionally, wearing the hijab. Women were kicked out of universities. Women were sent back to the home. So they viewed this as a religious purification. We viewed it as a civil rights violation and the loss of an ally. But then the real problem began. Islamic revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in 1979. Make sure you look at the link on Google Classroom. It's taken from the movie Argo, which if you haven't seen it, it's terrific. It's starring Ben Affleck, and it shows a scene of how the revolutionaries got into the American embassy. They took American hostages of the embassy workers, and they kept them for 444 days. I can remember this every single day on the news. They would talk about how long these men and women were kept in captivity. Carter failed in negotiating a release, and there was a botched rescue attempt by a helicopter on live TV, which 8 American soldiers were killed. So Carter's administration, Carter's term, was going down the toilet. And in 1980, he was up for re-election against Ronald Reagan. And to add insult to injury, on January 20th, 1981, the day of Reagan's inauguration, the hostages were released. So President Carter today is beloved. He's seen as a great humanitarian. He's seen as a moral man and a moral compass for the United States. He's in his 90s. He and his wife have been married for over 70 years, but his presidency was not successful. And throughout the late 60s and throughout the real decade of the 70s, very much a malaise, sort of a sickness, had its sway over the United States. We couldn't seem to win internationally, and things were really, really bad at home in terms of economics. I think in part, President Trump, when he won 4 years ago with his Make America Great Again, he was speaking to those people that had seen the country lose its dominance. We had seen our manufacturing go to other countries. We had lost jobs at home, and we had lost prestige in the United States. And that was the appeal, in part, for many people for President Trump's election. The next vodcast will take us through the 2 terms of President Ronald Reagan.